Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to those of you who have joined us in person. Welcome to those of you who are joining us virtually for this evening's program. I'm Rabbi Lori Koffman, Director of Content and Innovation at Park Avenue Synagogue, and I'm delighted to invite you to join us this evening with our wonderful guests, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, the Senior Rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue, Rabbi Hirsch, the Senior Rabbi at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, the Senior Rabbi at Kehilath Jeshurun, and of course our esteemed guest, Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Dr. Nachman Shai, whose biography I will read now for us all. Dr. Shai took on this position after many devoted years, both professionally and personally, in service of Israel and the strengthening of the relationship between the Jewish state and the Jewish people. The minister served as a member of Knesset representing the Labor Party from 2009 to 2019. During his time in the Knesset, Dr. Shai founded and co-chaired the Caucus for Strengthening the Jewish People. Minister Shai has held a number of positions in government, military, and media. Most predominantly, he served as the Israel Defense Force spokesperson with the rank of Brigadier General and was commander and editor-in-chief of Israel Army Radio. Following his military career, the minister held several positions in government, including Director General of the Ministry of Science, Culture, and Sport. The minister also served as Senior Vice President and Director General of the Jewish Federations of North America in Israel. Before taking on his current position, the minister was a visiting professor on U.S. college campuses teaching Israeli public diplomacy. The minister holds a PhD in political science and communications from Bar-Ilan University, and he has published 3 books focused on the intersection of Israeli diplomacy, media, and security. So, Baruch haba, bruchim habayim. Welcome everybody to this evening's program. And Minister, I'd like to start by asking you a question. You've been in your position for about 6 months now. So what have you learned? What have been the surprises? What are the challenges you see? And what are the opportunities? It's a big question with lots of parts.
And we have 1 hour, so I don't want to take all the time. But what I learned is that I don't know enough, and that I have to learn much more about the world Jewry, about the American Jewish community, and even about Israel, vis-a-vis the diaspora. And that's what I've been doing. And my visit here is also aimed to increase and expand my knowledge about American Jewry, and then to take this information back home and to figure out what can we do in order to better the relationship between you and us.
Great, great. So maybe some of our rabbis here can help educate you on some of the things that they would like to share. Anyone have something to start with?
We only have an hour, though. That's what you can.
Rabbi Steinmetz, do you have something you want to share?
About diaspora?
Or about American Jewry?
About American Jewry is. You're putting me on the spot.
I apologize.
Are we losing the American Jewry? And
you
especially
mean
the young generation?
Who is losing American Jewry?
Israel is losing the young American Jewry.
So, if you have to ask me that question, so my response to that would be that I think sometimes the fact that young American Jews seem to be slipping away from Israel is almost a Jewish problem and not an Israeli problem. Because I think that a lot of the slippage has to do with a loss of Jewish identity. It's very easy to jettison Israel if it seems inconvenient. If you're on campus and you find it inconvenient to declare yourself as a supporter of Israel because there are going to be people who are going to oppose you, people who maybe will make you feel guilty about certain things, then you'll do it. If you have a thicker Jewish identity, and part of that Jewish identity is Israel, and I think that almost by definition, your Jewish identity is Israel. I like to tell people that when God tells Abraham that he's going to start a people, and he's going to start this wonderful people called the Jews, he starts out by saying, Lech Lecha. You have to go to a land. It's impossible to imagine Judaism without the land of Israel. And I think part of why we have an Israel problem with some of the younger Jewish Americans is because we really have a Jewish identity problem. It's not a perfect proportion, and people will point out, well, this one is a very serious Jew, and yet they're anti-Israel. But I think a lot of it has to do with that. So, you're asking me what I could teach you about American Jewry.
So it has to do with Israel too. What we've been doing, for example, vis-a-vis the Palestinians, that's what I've heard so far, and so much that we mistreat them and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into politics, but that serves as one of the reasons that young American Jews try to distance themselves from Israel, and this is something which is hard to correct overnight.
Because Israel is not a narrative that everyone buys, and so for an American Jew to stand up for Israel, it's not as easy as it was 50 years ago. So then the question is, what is your bandwidth? What is your Jewish bandwidth? What is your connection to Israel? What's your connection to your Jewish identity? Because that will determine whether you're willing to say, okay, I stand up for this, afal pikein. Even so, I'm going to stand up for this.
Great.
So, first of all, if there's one thing that I want you to, I don't know how jet lagged you are, Minister, but this is your 8th event in the last 2 hours.
That's fine.
I want you to appreciate the visual of the 4 of us sitting right here. Because if there's one message that I want you to take back to Eretz Yisrael, to Medinat Yisrael, that you have the best Reform rabbi, the best Orthodox rabbi, and 2 kind of good conservative rabbis sitting here on the bima. And I want you to know that we're friends, right? That what you're seeing now is not, I just saw, if you knew how fast Rabbi Steinmetz runs around the park on the reservoir and Rabbi Hirsch, we just saw each other when I was running. We have relationships deep. Yeah, you can come jogging with us. That would have been a better program. But that there are, right, we have differences. Right? We interpret Jewish law differently. Our views on many issues might be differently, but we all love Israel as a people and as a nation. And our task is shared in that way. And there are people here and people watching at home who are also committed to that shared dialogue, whether they're members of KJ, whether they're members of Stephen Wise, or whether they're members of Park Avenue or any community. I think just to build on what Rabbi Steinmetz said, I think you have the emergence of 2 different world Jewries. Obviously, as Minister of Diaspora Affairs, you have responsibilities to the entire diaspora. But if you think about where the population centers are clustered in North America and in Israel, now 70 odd years later, you have the emergence of 2 different centers who experientially are shaped differently than they might have been certainly 70 years ago, but also in 67 and 73, this sort of shared post-Holocaust Hakamat Medina, establishment of the State of Israel. And now I think, just building on my colleague, you have this need for dialogue, because you have points of reference of young Israelis, secular or religious, young Americans, secular or religious, American Jews, whose life experience is different, and they're wondering, what do we have in common one with the other?
Rabbi Hirsch, do you want to join this conversation?
Yes, first of all, it's terrific to be here, and it's good to see you again.
I'm so lucky to have 4 rabbis on the floor with me. I've never had it in my life. Except from the fact that they are coming from different denominations.
But
that's
now
unbelievable.
you have to create 4 synagogues. It's a...
Minister Shai is, I still remember your appearances during the Gulf War and how soothing you were to the Israeli population. So to be able to not only sit with you now, but to have you the Minister of Diaspora Affairs is really I would say,
after Hanukkah, I guess, right?
Of course.
Sorry.
I would say 2 things. Number one, we really are friends, and we don't attack each other. We disagree with each other, and sometimes we disagree with each other publicly even, which is fine. But we have none of what happens in Israel with the political Haredi parties who just seek to marginalize and kick out of the Jewish people anybody who disagrees with them, certainly who's not Orthodox. Now, and we don't even have that among the Haredi population in the United States. First of all, a big part of the Haredi community actually raises money from people who are not Orthodox, so they have an interest not to do what they do in Israel. The primary reason that we have these vicious attacks on other Jews from Israeli politicians and not here, even though the Haredi often believe the same thing here in terms of their Jewish understanding, is in Israel they have political power. That's the primary difference. And therefore, they are forced here to try and persuade rather than coerce. And Israeli policy over the years has been distorted in a terrible way by this most reactionary force in the Jewish world. These aren't even values that are representative of the Jewish world. They're the most extreme, the most marginal, the most anti-democratic, and many of them are not even Zionist. And that is a question for the Israeli electorate. That's a question, of course, for you in government. And if you could make even marginal progress on that, I think that would make a difference in terms of at least the relationship with the leadership of world Jewry. I tend to agree with Rabbi Steinmetz about the overall problem, but I'll deal with that afterwards. The main point I want to emphasize here is you're a minister in the Israeli government. The government has distorted its relationship with world Jewry because they have been dragged by the most extreme elements of world Jewry and coerced politically to do that. If you could make any progress on that, that would make a very big difference in my view.
You've just touched the major mission of me in my present position. On my first day in office, I made 3 phone calls to the 3 heads of the denominations, and I made it clear that from now on our attitude is going to be pluralistic. And I spoke on behalf of the government and on behalf of the Prime Minister, and that's what we've been doing for 6 months. Recently, we decided to build or to introduce a new branch in our office that will be dealing with renewal Judaism. That's the first time in Israel's history, if I might say. Not only that, we are going to allocate for the first time state funds to help new organizations in Israel that have been going in the desert for 40 years, and finally they arrived to the promised land, and they will be assisted financially by the state of Israel, as well as we are doing here with the reform and conservative movement that it has never been done before. And the reason is quite clear, that we should treat or address you equally. And by the way, I agree with you, totally agree with you. This is something I'm not used to in Israel. And when I used to bring Knesset members to this country and delegations to learn about Jewish community, and when they took part in occasions like that, they said, we don't believe it. So I said, Messiah is coming. I mean, this is it. It's here. We just have to wait for another minute. But that's how I feel. And the new government of Israel, which is really a miracle by itself, political miracle, made of 8 parties, including Arabs represented in the coalition, which is extremely important, is all taking part in this pluralistic act. It's not only our initiative, the Labour Party. It's being taken care by the entire government, by all party members in the coalition. And we all agree that it's time to change. Even the Orthodox ones and the members of the coalition, the Prime Minister himself is leading this new attitude towards the denominations. I think it's something extremely important. So
is there money in the new budget specifically allocated for that?
Yes, there's 40 million shekels. I don't know, between the dollar and the shekel, the changes recently, but it's now above, it's like $12, $13 million. It's not only the money, by the way, which is extremely important to those new organizations, but also it's a message. It's a message that state money is not going only to the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, but also to the other side, to the conservative and conform movements, directly to the movements themselves, and then to those, I would say, sub-organizations. There are over 40 of them, part of this, the movement of renewal Judaism, that are going to be benefited from that money, and hopefully there'll be more in the years to come. We do everything to safeguard this also for the future, not only to the upcoming year. It's in the budget, and the budget was approved by the government.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's nice to have a budget too, right?
Okay.
No, I'm not kidding, actually.
Country has one. No, absolutely.
We believe that we are going to work also with the conservative and reform movements in this country. I met this morning with Rick Jacobson and Jacob Blumenthal, and we are going to have a partnership on doing, it's the same attitude, mutual relationship, matching and partnership together in this country as well, focusing on teenagers now, because we feel this is the link between the leading towards the universities, and maybe it's too late now to talking about young generation here. Maybe it's too late to reach out to them while they are already on campus, so we'll start with working in the high school as well. So you will hear about that more in the future, in the near future.
Wonderful. So one of the areas that has gotten a lot of attention is also the Kotel and what happens at the Kotel and the Kotel agreement. Can you speak a little bit about where that stands?
First of all, regards from the Kotel, because I've been there a week ago. I went to the egalitarian part of the Kotel. I met the Rabbi of the Kotel, Rabinovich, who was on his way to the left, and I was going to the right. He said, "How are you going, Nachman? You're going the wrong way." I said, No, I'm going the right way. You're going to the other side of the Kotel. I'm going to this small corner of the Kotel where we light candles with the women of the Kotel and with Bina and the parents of the Mechina of Bina and the students themselves. And again, Bennett, by the way, the Prime Minister went to the other way. Yeah. But anyhow, the Kotel is still there, I assure you, by the way, safe and sound. But we are working very hard how to pass a resolution that will approve or re-approve Netanyahu's outline for the Kotel. That I call it on the Netanyahu's name because he's responsible for that. It's not ours. We don't do anything new. We just would like that the decision made by the government in 2016 and then was suspended in 2017 will be renewed and will be operative again. It's not easy. Based on a kind of I would say even incitement, excuse me for using this word, but there is an incitement within the Orthodox community, within the political parties, and you, Laurie, related to the question of politics and religious in Israel, which is disaster. The Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox were incited to come and demonstrate against the old agreement. And they are just waiting for the timing. We don't want more wars between Jews and Israel. We don't need them, not now and never. But in the right timing, it will come back to the government table. There is a total consensus within the present government, with all the parties, members of the coalition, except the Arabs, they don't interfere with those affairs, with religious affairs, that this decision should be made. The question is not if, but when. When is the best timing? I hope it will not be done too late because we are pressing very hard. I mean, my party, myself, I see it as one of the major goals of my present position. If not that, why was I appointed and what will I do? It has to be done. It's fair. That carries the message of equality between every Jew deserves to have his or her spot next to the Kotel. There's no difference whatsoever between one Jew and another Jew. I hope it will be done soon. And I'm telling you, it's not a game. It's a political game, and we know how to play politics.
Rabbi, can I sort of ask a follow-up, stir the pot a little? If part of this is us to tell you something and you, Minister, to tell us something, I often wonder, and perhaps the thing I wonder about is something the community wonders about, is diaspora Jewry's role in impacting the Jewish life of Israel. And so number one, that's a thesis that you may not agree with, that we should worry about ourselves and let us worry about Judaism in Israel. But if the thesis of my career is that I would like the Judaism I preach, teach, and practice and model for my community is identifiable in Israel, and Israelis identify ours. Is the front line of this the Kotel? Is it to seed different communities, Masorti, Reform, other pluralistic communities? Is it to get involved with governmental decisions? Is it to, where do you see the most effective place for diaspora Jewry to move the needle?
You should teach the Israelis that that Judaism has many faces, not only one. I have nothing against the Orthodox movement. I myself go almost every Shabbat to an Orthodox shul, which is nearby. And by the way, the Reform community, I was served water. Thank you. Water is my reputation in Israel is to drink water. Anyhow, back to your question. The Reform shul in Mevaseret, where I live, has no Saturday morning service, by the way. No, that speaks for itself. Not enough members of the community, only Friday night. But so to tell the Israelis that simple story that you can be a Jew this way, and you choose your own way to be a Jew. That's the message. That's why we would like to help those small or middle-sized organizations that currently existing in Israel, and maybe by the end of this year or next year, there'll be 60 or 70 or 80, all kinds of communities. Everyone deserves to look at Judaism his own way and to decide how to perform as a Jew. So this is something you can teach us. This is what you can teach us, that we can live together. Because sometimes when I sit in the Knesset, I used to sit. Now I'm not a Knesset member. I'm just a government minister. But I have a seat in the building. I have a seat there around the table, and I listen to those Orthodox. Few of them are friends of mine. I don't believe what I hear. The way they talk about Reform Jews. I'm saying, these are Jews. No, I'm not sure they are Jews. What do you mean you don't mean it? What do you mean by that? Do you decide that Rabbi Elliot or Rabbi Chaim is not a Jew or is not a Jew? Who are you to make decisions? Or you decide that they are rabbi or not rabbi? Who are you to make those decisions? And even if you talk to them later, they express their opinions in a way that I cannot even repeat. So this is something that we have to learn to be able to live together. By the way, this is the political message for the present government is a message of unity, of living together. What's the story of this government? Half of the members of the cabinet are from the center right and even extreme right. Not too extreme. We left something for the right, for the wrong, but for the right. And then from the center left. Okay? And we live together. And we run the country for half a year, and I promise you we will be running the country for another 2, 3, 4 years. We will do that. So that's the message of living together, of compromising, of making compromise. That's the secret of, in my view, the Jewish life. So, but I have to tell you something. You have to, in a way, to get involved in Israeli politics. We have a Knesset member now, Gilad Kariv. The Harav Gilad Kariv is a Knesset member. He's one of the leaders of the reform movements in Israel, and he's very active in the Labour Party. His speeches and the speeches of the Orthodox are not to be well remembered because they attack each other, but at the same time, you should play the game as it is played in Israel. In politics. I mean, there's no other alternative. As long as the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox parties are involved in politics, you should play the game as well, if possible. But we play your game and other parties play your game, so you are in a safe place now. Much better than ever. much better than ever.
Well, if we're flipping the script, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I want to give you a chance to stir the pot also.
I have a question for my colleagues, and I'm worried that people at home might be starting to fall asleep because we're all getting along so well. But I do have a question for my colleagues. I really have a question and maybe have a follow-up comment from the minister. So why is it that the Reform and Conservative movement have had such limited success in Israel? What is it? I mean, I don't think you need government funding to pray together. And the question is what has been the limitation?
Well, just so I'm on the record, I strenuously disagree with you. I love you, but for you to tell the story of, well, if only we had a better chazan or a more charismatic rabbi, is a misread of the last 70 years of the state of Israel, right? There is, I'm saying it for dramatic purposes, but it's a huge disadvantage that the only religious expression of Judaism that has been supported financially, politically, and otherwise has been streams of orthodoxy, not the liberal movements. It's fundamentally different than the American landscape.
That's been the main hindrance. In other words, like, I mean, there are plenty of Orthodox synagogues that don't get a dime of government money. You can go up and down Meir Sharim also. I mean, the question, I mean, fundamentally, I mean, and we've heard this in other places, I mean, is there something, and I'm sure Rabbi Hirsch has something to say as well, do you feel that there's something very American that doesn't translate into the Israeli experience?
I would say this. Number one, it's not true that we haven't developed. We have developed in a very impressive way over the last several decades. Right. We started literally with nothing. When my parents came to Israel in 1973, there was almost nothing there. We have dozens of Reform congregations, kibbutzim, youth groups, and youth hostels, all done through the sweat of our brow, not with any support from any institution in Israel, but despite the active opposition of the full apparatus of the state, with all of its, centralized resources. These are, by the way, taxpayer money, most of which comes from non-Orthodox Jews, that is used to support and coerce Israelis in certain behavior and to create an environment that is very antagonistic and virulently opposed to any other form of Judaism, all supported by the Israeli government in one way or the other, through discriminatory budget approach, through rhetoric, through speeches in the Knesset, through just day-to-day activities. We're having a struggle now in Israel to set up a Reform congregation. Every municipality offers land. That's what happens in Israel. And there's a huge struggle to get land for a Reform congregation. And we've gone through one by one. Every Reform congregation in the country, in all likelihood, went through something like this process. So that's number one. The second thing is, I do think that we have a challenge in Israel. I do think it's important. I think the point that you're making is a good point, and this is for all of us here who care about Israel and care about non-Orthodox Judaism, care that there's a liberal or at least a non-Orthodox viable interpretation of Judaism, because that's what we believe in terms of our Jewish values. If we cannot establish strong, deep roots in Israel, our future, even in the United States, will be compromised, because Israel is increasingly the center of the Jewish world, and a movement that represents values that cannot become enrooted in Israel in the kind of way that Rabbi Steinmetz is suggesting in his criticism, is a movement that is destined for marginalization as we proceed through the 21st century. So that is something very important. We need to continue to try and persuade the Israeli government. By the way, when Minister Shai talks about persuasion, it's everybody else. The Haredi are not persuadable. They're just simply political opponents and ideological opponents that need to be prevailed upon by the rest of the political apparatus. But for the rest of us, we need to support our movements in Israel. We need to try and persuade the ones who are persuadable, which are the vast majority of Israelis who want to do the right thing. And over time, if we're able to do that, you need to contribute, you need to invest, you need to demand of our movements to invest more resources in the state of Israel for our own good here. And over time, if we can do all of that, and it's really important to get the Israeli government on board, this is a major step, even though the monies are not that dramatic in terms of the relative amount that has been set aside for pluralistic organizations as opposed to the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. Nonetheless, it's a significant first step. If we can continue to work here, most Israelis we know, because we do public surveys, most Israelis define themselves, like they do here, as not Orthodox.
Yeah, but they are used to, this is the only way that has been offered to them for many generations. There was no other alternative. It was clear that if you want to be a Jew, I mean, to perform as Jew, to go to shul or to have your brit or bar mitzvah or any other ceremony, it's always Orthodox. I'm one of the few that had the Reform bar mitzvah. I don't want to tell you how many years ago. And then my father was a member of the Reform community in Jerusalem, which was also an exception. But in general, it takes a long of time. And since this is the only path most of the Israelis knew, they didn't choose to become Orthodox. This is the way they are used to look at Judaism. And now it takes a long time to present to them different ways, different avenues, and different options how to be a Jew in Israel, and that's something new for many of us.
Can I just have one more thing, just to emphasize this? In addition to bringing this model to Israelis, which is really important, okay, what we really can bring to Israeli society is what we believe in our hearts, that Judaism is pluralistic and it does not require a Orthodox halachic lifestyle to live authentic Judaism. Mm-hmm. Most Israelis will be receptive to that message. And so it stands to reason that if we can bring the resources to bear, we will grow exponentially over the decades to come. And that's the key. You have to feel in your kishkas that the Judaism that we're practicing is authentic, and we must find a way to enroot in Israel, because Israel is now and will increasingly be the center of world Jewry.
So one of the issues, though, is in addition to recognizing the different denominations is the rabbinut and the definition of who is a Jew, who can get married. So in some ways, the rabbinut is reinforcing that notion that only the Orthodox, if you can only get married by an Orthodox rabbi, and many Jews, as you know, leave Israel to get married other places.
You can marry a civilian marriage in Israel, and that will be accepted by the Ministry of Interior. But not by the rabbinut. But not the rabbinut. Religiously, there's only one option. Yeah.
There's only one option. So in some ways, it's also that there's the problem in that regard as well. So it doesn't recognize conservative and reform rabbis performing marriages as legitimate marriages. Or conversions.
Or conversions,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
First of all, the issue of conversion is
right. Yeah. Say it again. Say it
they don't recognize a lot of Orthodox rabbis doing conversions as well. So.
Right.
But the present Minister of Religious Affairs or Religious Services is now pushing towards two major reforms, one on kashrut and the other on conversion too. It's not an easy struggle. He himself was given personal security guards since the weekend because he was already under threat. But he's an Air Force pilot. He's a colonel from the Air Force, so he is not so afraid of or concerned about that. But that speaks for itself. And he's being supported by Naftali Bennett, first of all, the Prime Minister, who is from the Tzionut Datit, the real Tzionut Datit, not the one the fake Tzionut Datit. And secondly, by the entire government. We would like to see changes. We would like to see changes. The kashrut became a burden. I mean, even those who respect kashrut cannot accept the fact that there's only one kind of kashrut, which costs a lot of money to every single Israeli. When they go to a restaurant or we're going to buy food, there's no reason. Anyhow, Tel Aviv now, by the way, is the most expensive city in the world. My goodness, what's going on? We all know Tel Aviv, the most expensive city, more expensive than New York, Paris, and London. My goodness. I think about many achievements of the Jewish state, but this is not the one we were looking forward to. Yeah. Anyhow, it's also about conversion. It's also trying to endorse more rabbis to be able to conduct conversion. And by the way, we need conversion, quick conversion in Israel for over 400,000 people living in Israel, made aliyah. They serve in the army, they pay taxes, they speak Hebrew, they run their life in the country. And if my son or my daughter marries them, these marriages are not accepted by the Rabbanut because whatever history they have. 400,000 people. So when we speak sometimes about intermarriage in Israel, the intermarriage in Israel now is 10%. 10% in Israel. So it's time to find ways for them. Those who are interested, there are some of them who are not, but those who are interested. The army has a special program that you are familiar with, but this is only for a few hundred soldiers, men and women, at the end of male and female, at the end of the military service. But we have to run a certain major operation to convert those who would like to convert and don't want to spend 5 years of their life by going through all the long process, and finally maybe the rabbis will endorse them or wouldn't endorse them. They don't know what the end process. They don't know. So this is a challenge for the state of Israel. It's a national challenge. They serve in the army, they fall, they are buried with other soldiers. At least the military Rabbanut understand the significance, so they're buried with their colleagues. There were some cases they tried to push them aside, but then, there was a military, and there was a national storm, and they found a solution for them. But I'd like them to be Jewish as live people, not as dead people, okay? Not to die in order to become fully equal to their peers. They serve in the army. They, as I said before, they stand all the test to be a full Jewish, a full Jew or Jewish, and at the end of the day, they're not regarded Jewish. That's unacceptable.
So I want to flip the conversation a little bit, and we talk about diaspora-Israel relations, but I think that there's often a misunderstanding of Israeli Jews about American Jews as well. Do you think that it's a question for actually everybody here. Do you think that that's an issue? Do you think it's part of the issue? Is it something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I spoke too much. I mean, I would like to hear the rabbis.
No, but these people hear me all the time, so...
too bad. So what was the question?
Do you think that Israelis understand American Jews? And do you think that it's important? And do you think it's important that they do?
It's a mixed attitude, I would say, of ignorance and arrogance, but it's true on both sides. Arrogance and ignorance. We don't know enough about your life here. We don't understand them. I talked earlier with you, Elliot. We live in a state, you live in a community or in a federation. And I remember when I traveled with Knesset members, even Gilad Ardan was one of them at the time, and others too, that were totally ignorant about American Jewish life. Not idea what does it mean? What does it mean to be a Jew in America? And we learned the history together. We learned the history, we learned the present, we learned how it started, and what kind of life you are experiencing here. But these are the small number of Israelis. We specifically choose the leaders, the political leaders, because and many of them were promoted, became government ministers. I remember Smotrich, you know the name Bezalel Smotrich, is one is extreme. We traveled once with Smotrich to Los Angeles. I have to tell you this story. I know we're running out of time. So Bezalel Smotrich arrived in Los Angeles at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's a long flight. 6 o'clock. At 12 hours later, we had a conversation with one of the community leaders, and then Smotrich told him, you don't educate your children the right way. So he looked at him and said, excuse me, sir, how many times you have been to America? He said, this is my first visit. When did you come to the country? He said, 12 hours ago. So now you teach me how to raise my children in the United States. Seriously, you can check. I give you the time, place, and the people that were in the room at the time. That's very typical. That's typical. We try to teach you how to run your life. We first have to understand what it means. It's not easy. Even explaining to the Israeli what anti-Semitism is not a simple matter. Because, thank God, we don't experience anti-Semitism. The other day, when a Jew was stabbed in the old city, in the city in Jerusalem, you could notice from the video released later on that the murderer, he ignored 2 or 3 people because he was not sure whether they were Jewish or not. The one he finally stabbed was dressed like a Jew. And this is the case with Eliyahu K., who was murdered a few days before in the old city because he was dressed like a Jew. He had a kippah, he had talit, and he was, because otherwise they wouldn't, that's anti-Semitism. That's it, I mean, a kind of, that's terror, but anti-Semitism too. It takes now a lot of time, energy, and money to teach the Israelis about Jews and Jewish life in the diaspora. We are working on that. This is our second challenge. One challenge is here, one challenge is there. How to bring those communities to understand each other, to really get to shared values, to get to the same place. Because historically it was much easier. Now it gets harder and harder because 78% of the Israelis were born in Israel, in an independent Jewish state, which is fantastic. But at the same time, they lack this kind of experience of living abroad and living with non-Jews around them. And what does it mean to maintain Jewish life when you are a minority surrounded by a huge majority from all aspects?
Yeah, I would just say the one thing that I've noticed is that the privilege of Israeli life, particularly specifically for secular Israelis, in which Judaism is automatic, and you don't have to think about it, becomes an enormous weakness, not only when they look at the diaspora, but if they decide to come and to move here. First of all, because they lack the consciousness of needing to connect to other Jews. In other words, this is, and I think that's actually the major weakness even in Israel. Jews for centuries were always looking to connect to other Jews. They didn't necessarily have the highest opinions of all of them, but you knew that if you were traveling, you'd look for the synagogue. I always have members, wherever they go look for the synagogues in the city to take pictures of them. You knew that if you're traveling, you look for a synagogue, you look for community, you connect to community. Not only that, you recognize that your Jewish identity can't be taken for granted. You need to work on it. And sadly, when Israelis come here, and I know that there have been many campaigns for Israelis that have moved outside of Israel, when Israelis come here, they send their kids to public school, and they're astonished that 8 years later, their kids know nothing, have no connection to Israel, no connection to Judaism. And I think that that's the privilege of Israel actually weakens to some extent some elements of Jewish identity. The need to be bonded to every Jew across the world, which is something that I think is hardwired into the Jews in the Golah, the Jews in the diaspora, is that you're looking, are there Jews in the Soviet Union that need help? Are there Jews in Syria that need help? And the second is that to recognize that you have to build your identity. So I think that if there is an issue in terms of the Israeli side of the ledger, is that the strength of Jewish identity in Israel actually weakens it once you leave Israel.
There is a good reason.
I'd like to just expand on that. In our synagogue, we launched a major initiative to reach Israelis who were living here. I see our president, Steve Silverstein, the president of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, who who is here and knows all about that program. We reached thousands of Israelis who were here with programs, all kinds of programs and ongoing connections. Sadly, it had to come to an end when the pandemic began, but hopefully we'll be able to get back to it. We, before we launched the program, we consulted with the Israeli consulate here. I'm not sure you're aware of this study that you did, not you personally, but your predecessors. They tracked Israelis who had immigrated from Israel during the 1948 through the mid-50s period. That was a very difficult period in Israel. A lot of people came here. And what they discovered is that there is no third generation of Israelis who came here in 1948. That the level of assimilation and Jewish disappearance of that group of Jews was more rapid than American Jews. And when you think about it, it was at the first level, it was surprising for us, but upon reflection, it made a lot of sense because of what Rabbi Steinmetz was saying. In Israel, the Jewish identity is absorbed through all of the emotions and mechanisms of the state, of sovereignty. There is no Jewish idea that is more powerful in the modern world than Jewish sovereignty. The one thing that can to some degree compete with the idea of Jewish sovereignty is the idea of religion. I know that Rabbi Cosgrove, I read your article that you published last week. I agree with it, a terrific article. Torah, okay, that is what kept the Jews alive for 2,000 years since the exile. But in the modern world, there is no more powerful idea than sovereignty, and that's what Israel provides for Israelis, and they glean almost through historical osmosis their Jewish identity. But because, I'm talking now about all of the Israelis but the Orthodox, who seek out Orthodox communities when they come here. But for the rest of them, when they come to the United States, when they come to New York, their identity is strong and fully formed. They often seek out other Israelis here, but they, one, find no need to affiliate with religious institutions. The heart of American Jewry and the engine that generates Jewish identity is the synagogue. And not only do they not feel a need to affiliate or attach to a synagogue, they actually are kind of repulsed by it because synagogue to them means Haredi and they want nothing to do with it. And so what happens to them within one generation is they send the children are completely Americanized. And the parents are stunned, and we spoke with literally dozens of these parents who were stunned that their children had no intention of Jewish content, of living a Jewish lifestyle that involved Jewish continuity. And so they behaved not only like their American Jewish counterparts, they behaved in a more assimilatory way because they had nothing to grasp the moment they left Israel, which constituted the idea of Jewish sovereignty. And the last point I would make is going back to the first point. That is what's another reason why it's so important for us to succeed in Israel. With your help, what you're doing is historically of major significance.
I had a call with one of the leaders of the Canadian Jewish community the other day. He told me, where's Tracy? My assistant? Okay, she listened, she was on the call. He said 9 out of 10, right? Israeli couples of intermarriage in Canada are Israelis. So the percentage of intermarriage within the Israeli community is much larger. I said in the general community, much less. Israelis, 9 out of 10, she said. And one of the reasons, so first of all, that's a major source of concern. The second is for us Israelis. And second is that why they are not joining the communities, because this is regarded as the final decision to remain or to live in America. And Israel is trying to run away from that decision, at least acknowledging that this is it. We finally decided to leave our country. Now we have an all-out war with Israelis living in this country, that in order to visit Israel, they have to issue an Israeli passport for the children. According to the Israeli law, you cannot, if you are born to Israeli parents, you have to issue an Israeli passport, which is fine. They don't want to. So they blame the country that it doesn't, but it's a law. It's not something that was done recently. This is the law. Every Israeli who would like to come to as a visitor to the country should have an Israeli passport, and if he was born to Israel. So they are moving from one side to another. Are you American now? Okay, so you don't need passport. But you need passport not to come to Israel. They don't want to issue Israeli passports. We are heading, we are traveling with my colleagues here to Miami this weekend, where the Israeli-American Council will have their yearly conference, and there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelis living in this country. It's in English. It's in English, not in Hebrew. And they deal with all kinds of issues, but they don't deal with the major question. Are we staying forever in the United States, or do we plan to go back to Israel one day? We decided as a policy to focus on one of the projects of my ministry is to focus on the Israelis living abroad and to hug them and embrace them, because we don't want to lose them. We don't want to lose any Jew, anytime, anywhere, okay? In any situation. And in this case, we still believe there is a strong foundation that either they will return to Israel one day, or if not them, their children, or even if they live in the diaspora, they will maintain the relationship with their Israeli relative. This is only the first generation. The second, I agree with you about the first generation, but the third generation of Yehudim from Israel, guys, are the best of the Israelis. These are high-tech employees, they are engineers, university professors. These are the top from the Israeli society. They are the top of the top, that we lose them to this country, mainly to this country, because they are being offered a lot of money and better opportunities and better research opportunities if they are in science and so on. So they prefer to live in this country. So we pay for it and we accept it in a way, but at the same time, we don't want to lose them forever. We still believe that one day they will decide to return home, or even if they live in America, they will perform as Israelis. But to join the American Jewish communities or federations is something that they still resist. And I've had many conversations with Israelis living in this country. This is the major reason.
Cosgrove, do you want to?
I'm enjoying this. I'm so honored to play host. Like, this is like the Super Bowl, and I have the best teams here, and I just get to play host. No, I have one question.
You enjoy yourself, and I do most of the talking here. So
this is like my favorite night of the week. I just get to sit here, and you get to do all the talking with wonderful colleagues. I think... something we're not going to have time, so I'll just ask the question very quickly, is the question of political power. All I'm reading in the news right now is the Iran deal. We haven't touched on that. And I'm just wondering, it's a huge question to ask in the last 3 minutes, but are you, as Minister of Diaspora Affairs, does this question of the role of American Jewry in shaping policy vis-a-vis the administration, does that play in, or is that beyond your portfolio?
This is one of the arguments I've been using in Israel for a long time, not only since I became a government minister. What I've been saying is the following. You want American Jews to help Israel in time of crisis, you have to listen to them. You have to hear what they expect from you. It's not one-way discussion, no longer. If American Jews expect Israel to do something, which is right, we have to listen, at least to listen and to respond, because very soon, my friends, we will need you. A crisis is coming between Israel, as far as I can see, and the United States, because I'm not sure that the Israeli government agrees 100% with the American position vis-à-vis the Iran agreement or disagreement. I don't know where we stand every single day. But it seems like America is ready to less than before. I mean, a new agreement that will include less restrictions on the Iranians, while we expect America to demand much more than the Iranians. What was missing in the previous agreement, which was cancelled by America withdrew from by Trump administration in 2018, I believe. Okay, but now something is coming, and Israel made very strong. By the way, the U.S. administration also made very strong statements, but I don't know what does it mean. I know that from the Israeli perspective, a nuclear Iran is an existential threat on Israel, on Israel's existence. And you can imagine what it means. So, as I said, I repeat on what I said, you will need American Jewry soon, like we have done in the past, during many crises, including wars, but not necessarily wars. There are many issues between Israel and the United States. American Jewry has always been there supporting Israel. But this dialogue cannot remain the same. We talk to American Jewish leaders, this organization, that organization. You should also listen to what they expect from you. That's what I've been saying in Israel, not for the first time. I just share with you what I've been saying all along. Don't take the American Jew for granted. Many of them are disappointed of Israel. Many of them are very critical of Israel, and they would not follow you automatically. No longer. It's a new generation. We just discussed it. It's a new generation of Americans. It's not like your parents or grandparents that have been admiring the Israelis day and night. Now you look at Israel differently, and which is totally justified. And when the time comes, let's see how it develops. But I want my colleagues, listen to the American Jewry. Not only in times of tension and wars, but also in peaceful times. Because when we need them, when we'll need them, maybe not 100% of them will come and help us. And that's something that we have to be aware of.
Thank you. I do want to use rabbinic prerogative for one bit of Torah, because we have 4 rabbis here. And I cannot help but notice, Minister Shai, that you chose this week of Vayigash, the establishment of the first diaspora community, when Jacob was anxiety-ridden about going down to Egypt, and the community established themselves. And the very first Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Yosef HaTzadik, was responsible for the well-being, and that's you. And there's this beautiful scene a week from now afterwards, Vayechi, where Joseph says, what's going to happen of me? And there's a command that he gives, Ve'alitem et atzmotaim, he said, that you should take up my bones from here and bury them in Eretz Yisrael. But as the rabbis here know, that it also means otzma, right? Otzma means strength. The Hebrew word. And so my blessing from this community is that you take the strength of these rabbis, of these communities, back to you and back to where you come from. And I want to thank Rabbi Koffman. Rabbi Koffman, do you want to have the final word?
Well, I wanted to thank the minister, obviously, the Israel Consulate, and the Deputy Consul General Israel Nitzan. Thank you for making this and all you do for us. And thank you for all all of you do for strengthening the relationships and chazak, v'nit chazek.
We have to thank the Israeli Consulate in New York for their help, and to the Park Avenue Synagogue and our audience here. It was very kind of you to take this evening and ignore other events that are taking place in New York at this time, because there are many competing functions similar or different than this one. And then to thank you very much for what you've been doing for Israel for so many years. And I hope you will be standing with us in any upcoming test or examination of our history. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Toda rabba. Just on time.
We have a lot to argue.